Hello and welcome to the podcast. My guest this week is the journalist John Ware, who spent almost 30 years as a reporter for the BBC, mainly on Panorama, and has won just about every award going, including a Royal Television Society Gong for Journalist of the Year and 5 other RTS awards. He made some of the most outstanding documentaries about the Troubles in Northern Ireland, made controversial documentaries about alleged antisemitism in Jeremy Corbyn's Labour Party, and is a regular contributor to the newspaper Jewish News, where he recently described the silence from parts of the Jewish community over events in Gaza as being at risk of becoming deafening. I don't think any journalist is truly fearless, but John comes closer than most. Hello, John. Welcome to the podcast. Is Gerry Adams the only person in the world who doesn't think he belonged to the IRA?
Pretty much. It was an extraordinary statement. He was in the court in Dublin and he said joining the IRA was not a path I took. Now, I've lost count of the number of former members of the IRA, both people who formed the provisionals back in 1969 and subsequently worked with Adams in the, quotes, Republican movement, who have a very clear recollection of him participating in IRA events. But more than that, I can distinctly recall at an Ardèche, which is a, for those of us who don't know, a sort of gathering of Sinn Féin's it's a sort of annual party conference at the Mansion House in Dublin, and Gerry Adams had been speaking, and I and a colleague, this is when I was on World in Action, went up to Danny Morrison, who of course remains one of his closest allies. Danny, there is no dispute, was in the IRA. And I asked Danny, was Gerry essentially going political? Were they going soft on the armed struggle? To which Danny replied, is this off the record? I'm about to break that undertaking. I said, yes. And he said, where do you think we came from? Quote unquote. Now, I have the transcript in one of my many boxes. There's no way that Danny can wriggle out of that. And he was referring to Gerry Adams.
And of course, it was Danny Morrison who famously said, if we have an Armalite, I think, in one hand and a ballot box in the other, who's going to say that's wrong? And so let there be no doubt. I mean, Gerry Adams was at the head of militant republicanism for how long I can't remember, but almost from the very beginning. Now, however, last week, and I obviously want to talk to you about the consequences of this, a Dublin court found that he was defamed in a BBC Northern Ireland Spotlight programme in 2016, in which another contributor alleged that Gerry Adams sanctioned the 2006 murder of Dennis Donaldson, who was a British agent but who worked at the hierarchy of Sinn Féin. Adams denied any involvement and won £84,000 in damages. And he said the case was, and I quote, about putting manners on the BBC. And he said the BBC upholds the ethos of the British state in Ireland. Well, setting that latter one ahead, is this a really damaging result that this Dublin jury found for Gerry Adams?
I guess the answer to that, Roger, is a generational one. Now, there were two parts to the verdict that the judge asked the jury to consider. The first part was, had the BBC been diligent, if you like, in checking out the allegation that Adams had in some way, shape or form sanctioned the murder of Dennis Donaldson, and had they expressed it as an allegation or had they expressed it as a fact? The jury found the latter. And so that took the jury on to consider what reputational damage had been done to Mr. Adams's reputation. Now, on that point, the judge's direction to the jury was, you may think that you've heard a lot of evidence about his alleged membership of the IRA, but essentially you need to consider his reputation as of 2016, when the program was broadcast. The man has a lifelong reputation. How you parcel up his time as a member of the IRA, a leader of the IRA, when the IRA were murdering people, as distinct from his more recent career, which has undoubtedly been peace building, The jury have basically said, as far as we're concerned, he deserves to be remembered. His reputation rests preeminently on his peace-building efforts. Personally, I think that's wrong, but that's because, unlike most members of the jury, probably every member of the jury, you, people of our generation, who covered the Troubles from the 70s, so much death and destruction, it's very hard to remove that.
I mean, I think clearly what's happening, I would have thought, is he chooses to go to a court in Dublin, which is more likely to be sympathetic. He chooses to go, well, it's a jury trial, of course, therefore composed of a lot of people, younger people who would not have experienced that. And it's all part of the strategy of Sinn Féin, isn't it, with the elections in both North and the South, to represent itself essentially as a peacemaking organisation that can unite Ireland. The inconvenience of being reminded about the blood on their hands and the people they bombed and the people they killed. Of course, there were plenty of people on the Protestant paramilitary side that did the same, but that inconvenience can amount to a sort of washing of history. I mean, in another entirely different example, the way in Japan they refuse to acknowledge what they did in Manchuria, for example, it's not in history books, it's inconvenient history. Are we not now seeing an attempt to eliminate, if you like, inconvenient history?
Yeah, I agree with that. I think more cynically, we might be seeing an attempt by Gerry Adams to really go for the presidency of Ireland, and whether he get it or not, another matter. But that's always been his ambition, at least to be the Tánaiste, to be the deputy. But he's not a TD anymore, I don't think, is he? I don't think he is.
No.
So that goes out of the window. But I imagine, Sinn Féin in power in the north, it's not inconceivable. Unlikely, I think, but it could be one day in power in the south. So that, I think, is all part of what's been going on. Look, Gerry has been at this for years and years. I remember when I've made 2 documentaries about Gerry Adams, one for World in Action and one for Panorama. And I do remember in the first programme, we were threatened with legal action. I know for a fact that his lawyers, and I wasn't the only person who Gerry flirted with the idea of suing. And every time he came up with the idea, he was advised, don't do it, Gerry. So he didn't. A generation has passed. The case was heard in a different jurisdiction. The jury were young. Gerry's now got a kind of Corbyn-esque grandpa image. His beard is white. He talks the language of peace, and he had, most importantly, Paul Tweed, who wins more cases than he loses, let's say, defamation cases. It was brave of the BBC to defend this, I thought. I never personally, it doesn't surprise me the BBC lost. I think it's the wrong verdict, but it does surprise me they lost.
But I think in these circumstances, there are 2 dangers, aren't there? There's a danger, if you like, the BBC just looks at the cost of this, and I don't know what the costs are, but people talk about the range of 3 million, something like that. They also, so they think, well, soon, maybe we shouldn't do that again. And then Gerry Adams talks about, quote, putting manners on the BBC. And I noticed that the NUJ in Ireland have talked about threats to freedom of speech. Do you think there is a real threat here that people will be tempted to say, well, I mean, when you and I were involved in this sort of stuff, the programmes weren't popular anyway. They took a long time to make. There are lots of our fellow colleagues who didn't want to go to Ireland. Now, when you have all of this, there is a real danger people would say, oh, it's the past, let's just forget about it.
Yeah, look, is there going to be a chill factor from this? Well, certainly there's going to be a chill factor on suggesting Adams has had anything to do with terrorism since the Good Friday Agreement. That's for sure. I'm not so convinced, actually, on reflection, that there is as much of a chill factor about, talking about whether he was a member of the IRA. I just can't see. He did not sue on that particular point. I can't see him suing on that. He'd be flattened.
I mean, he was a member. Let's not pretend. Of course, he was a member of the IRA, and there are enough people on the record who are dead but have left recordings, and people alive today who know that. So there may be an argument about when he formally left or whatever. But the fact that he was directing militant Republican strategy with Martin McGuinness through those last 30 years, running up at least anyway to the Good Friday Agreement is in the end indisputable. And if he wants to have a go at us for saying that, well, he should have a go.
Roger, if Gerry wasn't in the IRA, I'm the Queen of Sheba, frankly. I mean, it's as simple as that.
Can I move on then from that to another area which you're heavily involved in at the moment, and also obviously have some personal involvement, which is the coverage of the Middle East, which has been extraordinarily difficult for the BBC, but also for people like yourself. And I was very struck by the article you wrote in Jewish News, in which you said, vis-à-vis, I think, the situation in Gaza, the silence from parts of the Jewish community is at risk of becoming deafening. You said the truth is that most British Jews do feel shame in many of Israel's actions under Netanyahu, but by and large, Jews have chosen not to express their deep misgivings publicly, inhibited by the close connection they feel with the Israeli nation and a reluctance to offer a bone to Israel's haters. That now needs to change. What is it that has made you write that article?
Well, first and foremost, I guess, for several reasons, but first and foremost, journalism. I can't abide agenda journalism. It is true, I've made many programs and written many articles supporting aspects of Israeli policy, exposing things like Hamas fundraising and so on and so forth. As a journalist, if you start to see the other side, the side that you have focused on and been generally supportive of, and you start to see them behaving in the way that I'm afraid I believe that the current Israeli government is, you can't, if you're curious, you can't in all conscience just ignore that. And there are a lot of journalists increasingly who do that. And I refer to that as agenda journalism. Every night, Owen Jones shrieks rabidly on YouTube and written stuff he writes about what a hateful place Israel is. Well, he's entitled to that, but you never hear him. You never, at least as far as I can see, you never or rarely hear him looking into the activities of Hamas. I just don't think that's proper journalism. Apart from anything else, journalism is about, for me anyway, and I know it is for you, Roger, and it is for most mainstream journalists, it's really about curiosity and going where the evidence takes you, without trying to sound too pompous, because actually the way things are, rather than the way you might want them to be, is the chase and the challenge.
But the pressure on somebody like you, in these circumstances where we've got a propaganda war going on, where we've got plenty of people waiting, delighting in attacking Israel, even, and I want to come to this in a moment, a little bit later, people are now denying that the atrocity of October the 7th against Israel civilians happened. That's all going on. There is, I know, such pressure on people like you from within the Jewish community saying there are enough people out there going for us. Please don't do this. Or at least only talk to us about it, don't talk to the outside. That's why I'm so struck by the fact you felt in the end you had to write something which, yes, was in Jewish News, but would have been read more and has been read more widely.
Well, so that's the sort of professional side of it, the fact that you can't stay silent in support of one side. That's the first thing. The second thing is, of course, I'm actually not Jewish, but as happens, my wife is, my kids are. So I'm pretty familiar with what's going on in the Jewish community. Many of my best friends genuinely are Jews, And I see this terrible dilemma that they're in. I express a personal view. I think if you spend as much time as Jewish community organizations have over the decades supporting Israel, and supporting Israel for reasons which I completely understand, then when Israel behaves in the way that it has, I think there is an onus to speak out. In no way does that mean that they should be held accountable for the current Israeli government. Of course, they should not. They have no vote. But you can't run with the hare and hunt with the hounds. So, that's my position on that.
And on the question of what is happening in Gaza, skepticism is perhaps properly expressed when it comes to precise numbers of those who have died and have been wounded and so on. And there must be caution because the figures do come from the Hamas Health Ministry. But having set that aside about precise numbers, there can be no doubt, can they, that there are very large numbers of women and children and civilians being killed and wounded, and that there is a real, if not mass starvation, there is a real desperate aid situation. And to deny that is to deny the facts.
I agree, Roger. You only have to look at the scale of devastation. That's entirely consistent with very high numbers of casualties. Now, it's true that the Hamas Health Ministry is the source of these figures, but actually in the past, I think I'm right in saying, they have broadly, I emphasize broadly, aligned with the settled view on numbers killed. But even putting our own armchair assessments aside, if two former prime ministers like Ehud Olmert and Ehud Barak are saying the number of civilian deaths is unacceptable, that the war is pointless, that there is an alternative, namely in the shape of some sort of technocratic interim regime, which, doesn't, because the aim of this war is to get rid of Hamas. I don't think most reasonable people would understand, whatever critical view you take of Israel, that no functioning Gaza government in the future can operate run by Hamas. They do have a genocidal agenda. There's no doubt about that. So, there is a solution. There is an alternative to the war if you listen to the Baraks and Olmerts. And these are not peaceniks. These are prime ministers who've, started wars, have been in charge of wars, and Barak is a former defense minister. I mean, he's a bit of a war hero. These are not, snowflakes.
And yet, you see, when we talk in these terms, trying to, and of course, journalists outside, independent journalists can't get into Gaza to personally verify things. When we try to report this, or people in the BBC try to do it, then you immediately get this tidal wave of criticism from people like a former director of television, of course, Danny Cohen, who says, at a response to one thing, no BBC show now seems safe from antisemitism. The BBC is institutionally anti-Semitic. It's institutionally hostile to Israel. The BBC newsroom is out of control. Now, allowing for mistakes that everybody makes, how do you respond to somebody like Danny Cohen when he makes those statements?
Danny's wrong. The BBC is not institutionally anti-Semitic. There are certainly pockets of ignorance, certainly. The BBC Arabic service has had a consistent run of problems, presenters doing one thing and then on their social media doing another. That's not acceptable for any BBC employee, obviously. And there have been mistakes with BBC News as well, and also in BBC Two. Most recently, this Gaza documentary. I mean, what went on there, I think I can probably guess, but
we're talking now about the BBC Gaza documentary, which featured, as it turned out, a young boy whose father had a connection with the government. I mean, John, do you think that in the past, what we'd have done with a documentary like that, we'd have looked at it, there's clearly a mistake of labelling and question marks, but we would have found a way of transmitting it, perhaps surrounded by a studio programme which says, we can't verify this, this is the connection, however, we can verify this, this is the documentary, and so on. It's now buried somewhere. And what do you think the BBC should do about that?
Well, there's an inquiry going on, I understand. Now, there were, I think, 3 BBC execs. I mean, these are senior people, the head of department, and of course there was an exec from the production company itself. I mean, it just beggars belief, frankly. Questions were asked, I think, what connection does this family have with Hamas? But for some reason, the answers weren't forthcoming. And then, of course, the BBC, as I understand it, wrote the script for the presenter lad. Money was paid into the bank account of a relative. I mean, we know how these things work. I mean, there were just so many red flags. It's not that you couldn't do a programme about Gaza. It's essential there are programmes, plural, about Gaza. No question about that. But how that got through in the way that it did beggars belief. But it's had a really constraining consequence. I think it's partly because of that the BBC's coverage, and Danny Cohen will not approve of what I think I'm about to say, the BBC's coverage actually is quite timid, in my view, given what is going on in Gaza. Panorama should be all over Gaza. I think it should be all over what's going on in Israel as well. But you get a sense, I may be wrong, I may be, I'm outside of the BBC, but you get a sense that there's a kind of, don't go there, don't go there. So most of the BBC's reporting on this conflict has been, in my view, reactive. The BBC has not cracked a whole new block of ice in the way that the American networks have on both sides of the conflict. They've had new and important things to say, which they've discovered. I don't see much original journalism coming out of this conflict. I see very professional reporters like Paul Adams and various others reporting on it. Not every reporter, some reporters, no names, no pack drill, you can sense what they really think. But others, you don't know really what they think, but they manage to reflect what's going on without showing their slip, which is, of course, is the ultimate mark of a proper professional journalism.
So you think there's a real danger of people being scared off? And we remember over the decades in the coverage of Northern Ireland, there were periods where you didn't actually get stopped, but people would say, do you really have to do this? And where we had the most difficulty, I felt, was not in reporting events, bombs going off or whatever, but asking the deeper questions, the analytical questions, placing into context. That's when it got politically difficult. That's when you get the pressure. And you can see on a beleaguered BBC at the moment, and particularly people like Danny Cohen are sounding off in the way they are, the temptation would be to just report what happens, don't ask more deeper questions. It's very saddening that should be the case. But I want to pick up one other thing with you, which I hadn't been aware of, and you have pointed out, is the growth of what seems to be denialism on the side of those who are supporting, well, what they would call Free Palestine, which amount now to, among some, the denial that the October 7th atrocities, and I don't think there's any way of describing it other than as an atrocity, did not involve Israeli civilians. How widespread is this, John? I mean, is this just a small element, do you think? But it's very disturbing.
I think it is a small element, to be fair, but you don't have to look far to find it in pockets, certainly, of this country. You can find it in a number of mosques. You can find it on the left. It's been amplified mostly in alternative media, which, has quite an influence, certainly has an influence within the pro-Palestinian reading population. Yeah, it's deeply troubling. And the allegation that really got sort of dismantled and dismissed was the allegation of sexual violence. Most of the alternative media outlets that certainly I've looked at would accept that a lot of people died on October 7th. There's a dispute about the ratio between civilians and soldiers, and there's also an allegation by an organisation, for example, called the Electronic Intifada, which is quite influential amongst some sections of the pro-Palestinian constituency in this country. But when it came to allegations of sexual violence, rape, mutilation, genital mutilation, that sort of thing, they absolutely came down on that like a ton of bricks against the evidence. The circumstantial evidence is very powerful that Hamas and some other armed groups did both rape, mutilate both women and some men on the 7th. Whether it was a policy or whether it was, happened just randomly, it's hard to say. But it's pretty horrific stuff. And I think the reason that these outfits were so determined to knock that on the head was because essentially nothing damages the whole idea of the resistance, quote unquote, more than this sort of monstrous behaviour. So they had to diminish it.
What this reflects is what it's about more generally is a lack of confidence or lack of trust in central organisations like the BBC, and a penchant for those channels which reflect back to you your own views, maybe your own prejudices, or basically the sense that you are being misled. Don't trust them, trust us. And where we used to be able to operate on the basis that our job essentially was to establish the facts, then you can argue about the policy or whatever. Now there is such a distrust that it's difficult to get an argument on the facts. And now we've got, clearly with Gaza, such a polarisation that you wonder if it ever be possible to get any agreement what does, in circumstances like that, what does a public service broadcaster do? Your view is essentially, as I understand, is the BBC should get more heavily involved in analysis.
Absolutely. I mean, what other option is there? We're all going to end up in echo chambers if we're not careful. I know we said this before, but honestly, it's got to be true now in this social media post-truth age. There has never been a more important time for public service broadcasting with the kind of ethos, rules that operate the vast majority of the time in the BBC, whatever people may think of the BBC's coverage of Gaza. You know, and I know that most of the time the rule book does apply. It just does. And that doesn't make the BBC anti-Semitic. It makes the BBC wrong, insensitive to Jewish sensibilities sometimes, but it doesn't make it anti-Semitic. I mean, there clearly have been mistakes in the BBC's coverage, quite significant ones. But in a way, they're being used now, I think, in a very shrill way to say, well, you can't believe anything the BBC says. And that's just unhelpful, because apart from everything, it's not true. So while I do think the focus obviously has to be on Gaza, an awful lot of people are dying there, have died, and it's clear a lot of people are extremely hungry. It is absolutely right for the BBC to be focusing on Gaza, whatever anyone else says. It's also true, in my view, that there has been a woeful deficit of attention on the Palestinian Authority. There is, in its broadest sense, or has been, leaving aside this very right-wing messianic government, until they came along, I think it's fair to say there was a sort of unspoken belief that, but for settlements, but for the West Bank, there could be a settlement, there could be a two-state solution tomorrow. I think that's fanciful. That isn't to say the two-state solution isn't the only solution. I personally think it is, but leaving that aside, well, we haven't had anything, as far as I can see, any program has spent any time in the Palestinian Authority looking at for example, the official outlets, which almost daily spew out the most revolting anti-Semitic tropes. It is institutionalized there. The corruption and so on. So the idea that but for settlements, but for IDF excesses and so on and so forth, there could be a settlement tomorrow, I think is simply wrong. And I think broadcasters, the BBC included, especially the BBC, I would say, have not spent anything like enough time over the last 2 decades looking at the Palestinian Authority. And Palestinian rejectionism. Broadcasters spend an awful lot of time looking at Israeli objectionism, fair enough. No time at all looking at Palestinian rejectionism, because it exists. So there's never been a more important time, in my view, for public service broadcasting to do its job. It needs more funding. It really does. We have to dominate the debate. The alternative media is range finding on what they call the mainstream media. We're getting attacked every which way, from agenda journalists to the right, to the left, everything. And the mainstream media has been particularly, it's a swear word now, the mainstream media, for many of these outfits. It's not a swear word. It's not perfect, but it's a hell of a lot better than any other outlets.
And of course, aside from the fact of this obviously being a very polarising conflict, with people feeling very strongly and emotional about that, the other thing that's going on with BBC also is a clear attempt by certain organisations, for example GB News and Talk TV and others, to eliminate competition. I mean, I could quote Sir Paul Marshall here, who gave a speech. He's the proprietor of GB News, The Spectator and Unheard, the Unheard website, which is often has really interesting things to say. But he's called for the BBC to be broken up and its fact-checking service shut down. He says the BBC squats like a giant toad in the middle of the UK media landscape. It is a propaganda arm of the state. So, John, when you worked for Panorama, you were clearly part of a propaganda arm, weren't you?
It's just gibberish. It's nonsense.
But then it's reported as a serious speech and a contribution to broadcasting in the Daily Telegraph and elsewhere. And there's Sir Paul. Well, he's a very influential figure. It is a very dangerous time, the assumption that there isn't truth. There are truths, and you can have your truth, and I can have my truth. and nobody actually goes on the ground and says, well, this is, as far as I can see, what happened.
Well, that's why public service broadcasting needs more, not less support. Now, if you look at Panorama, my old stable, they're pretty much holding the line. Budgets are squeezed, but they're still knocking out, whatever it is, high 30s programmes, pretty much the numbers that the BBC were putting out when you were editor of Panorama, Roger, although you had double the length, of course. And they're still doing some decent work. Dispatches, I think, has diminished. I may be doing them, I think they're down. I mean, there was a time when they were doing 40 slots a year. I think they're down to, 10 or something? There's the odd stuff coming out of ITV. When it does come out, it's excellent stuff run by Tom Giles, extremely able guy, called Exposure, but there isn't enough of it. So that needs to be reinforced, in my view, because the BBC does. Who was it who said this? It's true. Was it Michael Grade? The BBC does actually, without trying to sound smug, complacent, the BBC does, broadly speaking, keep us honest.
Although, as in his later incarnations, Mr. Grade, or Lord Grade, I should say, had said rather different things, whatever, on this issue. It's just demoralised. I suppose I shouldn't, having been last night on GB News doing something, I just get a little bit demoralised that there are a significant number of people who call themselves journalists in this country now working on programmes whose sole aim seems to be to get people angry, to persuade them there's a conspiracy against them, that if only common sense could rule. And there's a lack of trust in so many institutions. So when you or any of us try to say, we've honestly tried to find out what the situation is, we're not sure about this, we're sure about that, on the whole, people would say, well, they would, wouldn't they? So there's a crisis of trust, there's a crisis of funding. It's a very difficult time.
It is, but it goes back to my bête noire, which is agenda journalism. There's a lot more of it. And
what do you mean by that? People who essentially have a particular position and go out to find the evidence to support their position and ignore evidence that doesn't.
Exactly. I don't know that's not journalism. It's not journalism. I go back to what I was saying earlier. It's not journalism that you and I have engaged in and, which is the real challenge. It's about propping up an argument. Well, then, join a PR firm, but don't call yourself a journalist. Journalism is about checking out the world the way it is, not the way you want it to be. And any argument, these are all cliches, but they're true. Any argument is only as strong as its weakest link, and so on, so on, so on, so on. So on. And, all those meetings that we had before we were about to broadcast a very controversial programme that's going to upset an awful lot of people, most of the time, not all the time enough, but almost all the time, the scrupulous regard for accuracy, fairness. Can we sustain that? And I know that process goes on. Most people out there don't know that, but it does go on. And there needs to be more of it. And it doesn't go on. Where it doesn't go on are these echo chambers. That's where it doesn't go on, because they don't want to hear evidence that spoils the trim of their argument. And that's not journalism. It's agenda journalism. It's propaganda. It's not journalism.
And just one final thing, John. After you going back to the article you wrote for Jewish News, what was the reaction? Are there people who say, doubtless you've got a varied series of reaction, but did a substantial number of people say to you, well done, thank God you've written that?
A lot of Jewish friends did, actually. Some were notably silent. One or two said that I didn't have the right to comment on Jewish feelings about the war because I'm not Jewish. I think I'm not Jewish, but I'm an honorary Jew, I think.
And your children, because your wife is Jewish, your children are Jewish, yes.
Yeah, so I'm immersed in the Jewish community. So, okay, I'm not genetically a Jew, but I have a big stake in the Jewish community, put it that way. So I don't take that sort of thing seriously, but it is reflective of, defensive response to this war. As I say, I think Jews are in a terrible dilemma between, what they can see with their eyes. And, I think it's easier for me, a non-Jew, to recognize and come to terms with what I think is going on in Gaza. I think it's harder for them because they can see the dream dying. This miracle, if you like, of not a perfect birth, but an extraordinary history of 70-odd years with all the incredible achievements that Israel has achieved, and, the fact it's testimony to Jewish survival, resilience, courage, humour, all of those things. And I think if you're Jewish and have felt part of the soul of Israel, as I think most Jews to a greater or less extent do, you can see that dream dying, and it must be very painful.
John Ware, thank you very much. My thanks to John Ware, and apologies we didn't bring you our interview with Ian Dale. That pleasure is going to be delayed until next week. If you're enjoying our journalism, please do support us for less than the price of a cup of coffee per month. You can do this by either a one-off payment on our crowdfunding page or regularly by signing up to patreon.com/BeebWatch for £1.99 per month. By signing up to Patreon, this will also entitle you to my weekly blog, which gives my take on the week's interview. The link to this and to our crowdfunding page can be found in the description of this programme. That's it for this week. As you probably know, this podcast is presented by me, Roger Bolton, and it's produced by Kate Dixon. The sound is by Dave Kitto, and special thanks to Quinn Genty. It's a good egg production. Until next time, goodbye.